Should I reject the only marriage proposal I've ever wanted to say yes to? My childhood friend Adrian called me at 2 a.m. after 6 years of pretending I didn't exist and asked in a shaking voice, "Will you be my girlfriend? Just for a few weeks?" I thought he was joking around, but his tone was sharp and serious. The guy who once told me, "Get off my back and leave me alone," suddenly wanted to date me. Before I could say no, I heard his sniffles in the background like he'd been crying. Grandma's on her last few breaths. It's her last wish, so please don't say no. My chest squeezed painfully. The woman who raised him after his parents passed was now leaving him too. I couldn't imagine the pain. I looked at the empty college thesis I was working on and answered him, "I'll agree to it if you're willing to be a part of my thesis." Sure. 3 days later, Adrian knocked on my door, and seeing him face to face made me realize just how things had changed in 6 years. He wasn't the scrawny kid who cried when I ran and left him behind. He was taller and shockingly gorgeous, which made a lot of sense for a model who showed up on billboards. His smile disappeared the moment he saw me. "You're meeting my grandma in sweatpants?" I looked down at my outfit and over to his. "Hey, not everyone can afford designers." He ran his hands through his hair and pushed his way into the house. Minutes later, he pulled out an entire outfit that matched well. "There, now you'll look like you're there to actually greet my family as my girlfriend." Girlfriend. Those words made my heart race and ears burn red. Definitely not a term I was used to hearing. When we left to go visit his grandma at the hospital, she instantly grabbed my hands the moment she saw me. "I knew it," she whispered. "I always knew you two would find your way back to each other. So tell me, how did it happen? Show me the pictures." Adrian and I stared at each other with wide eyes. Adrian coughed. "It's all on my other phone. I must have left it at home. We'll just send it to you later." She smiled. "I'd love that, dear." After the visit, Adrian and I sat there in the parking lot silently. "So," I said, breaking the tension, "let's go on a date," he said, interrupting me. He drove to a well-known coffee spot for couples and sat across from me with an annoyed expression. "Aren't you gonna take pics of me to save on your phone?" I laughed. "Why would I do that?" He crossed his arms. "It's what girlfriends do. Don't tell me you still haven't dated anyone." I stirred my coffee angrily. "That, sir, is a good thing, okay? I'm waiting for true love." Now he laughed. "Still into those fake fantasies? Still afraid of spiders?" I snapped back. We glared at each other before bursting into laughter. And for the first time, I saw his genuine smile. Without realizing, I lifted my camera and snapped pictures of it. We spent the rest of the day practicing our couple pics. And honestly, being with someone so photogenic absolutely sucks. Even when he was caught off guard, he looked handsome. But me? I looked like Lord Farquaad from Shrek. During our break, we worked on my thesis interview. "Why modeling?" He shrugged. "Pictures last longer than people." "What's your motivation? Grief over your parents?" His face grew cold. "Next question." At the end of the day, we sent his grandmother all the pics and videos, and she gushed over it. "My great-grandchildren will be so beautiful. If only I could live long enough to see it." And as if by horrible coincidence, his grandmother's vitals suddenly dropped that night, nearly taking her life. I found Adrian collapsed against the wall outside the emergency room sobbing. "I can't lose her too." His voice cracked. "She's all I have left." I bent down and hugged him, rubbing his back while I peeked into the room. "She's strong. She'll get through this. Just breathe, Adrian. Be strong for her." His hands gripped my shirt tightly. After a few hours, his grandmother pulled through. "God's not ready for this much attitude," she said weakly. While Adrian went down to get food for her, she held my hand and opened up. "Poor kid is afraid of hospitals, and now he has no choice but to constantly visit one because of me. I'm just glad you're here with him." I smiled, the guilt of this fake relationship weighing heavily on me. "Don't tell him I told you, but you know he had a crush on you as a kid?" I laughed. "Yeah, right." "Oh, I'm serious. You made him cry a lot, but at home, gosh, he'd tell his parents he would marry you." When Adrian entered the room, his grandmother sat up and asked for her purse. She pulled out a small box and opened it, revealing a beautiful vintage ring. "This ring," she said, "survived everything. The old country, wars, your grandfather's terrible cooking." She was trying to joke, but her eyes were wet. "This was your mother's ring, Adrian." Adrian went completely still. "She wanted you to marry someone who didn't care about your pretty face, someone to wipe your tears away when they were no longer around." She put the ring in his hand. "I'm dying, sweetheart. Let me be pushy. Just this once." Adrian looked at the ring, then at his grandmother, then at me. He got down on one knee, right there next to the heart monitor, and took my hand, stroking the back of her hand gently with his thumb. "Will you marry me?" I was torn. No, I love yous. No heartfelt speech. None of the things that made it real, because it wasn't real. "Adrian," I froze. My mouth opened and closed like a fish out of water while Adrian stayed frozen on his knee, the ring shaking slightly in his hand. His grandmother leaned forward in her hospital bed, eyes bright with hope despite the tubes and wires attached to her frail body. The word came out before I could stop it. "Yes." Adrian's hands trembled as he slid the ring onto my finger, the metal cold against my skin. His grandmother let out a sob that turned into a laugh, reaching for both of us with her thin arms. We hugged her gently, careful of all the medical equipment, and I felt Adrian's body shake against mine. The nurse came in to check vitals, and we stepped back, Adrian's hand still gripping mine like he was drowning. His grandmother wiped her eyes and told the nurse about the engagement, her voice stronger than it had been in days. The nurse smiled and congratulated us before adjusting the IV drip and leaving. Adrian's grandmother closed her eyes, still smiling, and drifted off to sleep, clutching her rosary. We walked out into the empty hallway, and the moment the door clicked shut behind us, I pulled my hand away and started tugging at the ring. Adrian caught my wrist and closed my fingers around the ring instead. "Keep it on until she gets better," he said quietly. His eyes had that desperate look again, the one that made my chest hurt. I nodded because what else could I do when he looked like that? Like his whole world was falling apart. We took the elevator down to the parking garage in silence, our footsteps echoing off the concrete walls. Adrian unlocked his car, and we both climbed in, sitting there in the dim fluorescent lighting. I twisted the ring on my finger while he gripped the steering wheel. "We need rules," I said finally. He nodded without looking at me. "No posting on social media," he agreed, "and we only tell people who absolutely need to know." I added that we'd figure out what to do once his grandmother got stable, and he flinched at the word "once" like I'd slapped him. The drive to my apartment was quiet, except for the radio playing some old song his grandmother probably loved. Adrian dropped me off without coming inside, just sat there watching me walk to my door like he was memorizing it. The next morning, I had to meet with Ailsa for my weekly thesis check-in. She noticed the ring immediately, her eyebrows shooting up to her hairline. I sat down across from her desk and tried to explain the situation without sounding completely insane. "So, you're engaged to your research subject?" she asked slowly. I explained about the fake part and his dying grandmother, but she shook her head and pulled out a form from her filing cabinet. This creates serious ethical problems for your research, she said. The form was about conflicts of interest and she made me sign it, warning that my thesis might get rejected if the committee thought I was too personally involved. My phone buzzed with a text from Adrian saying his grandmother wanted to see photos of us from over the years, pictures we obviously didn't have since we hadn't talked in 6 years. I met him at his apartment that afternoon with a bag full of different clothes. We drove around town taking pictures at various spots, changing outfits in gas station bathrooms to make it look like different seasons. First, we went to the park where we used to feed ducks as kids, Adrian wearing a light jacket while I put on a sundress. Then the movie theater where we'd seen our first PG-13 movie, both of us in hoodies like it was fall. The coffee shop got winter coats and the beach got summer clothes even though it was way too cold. Adrian was good at this, knowing exactly how to angle the camera and where to stand to make the lighting look different. Between locations, we barely talked except for him giving directions or telling me where to stand. At our old elementary school, we sat on the swings taking selfies when Adrian suddenly stopped and stared at the monkey bars. "This is where I told you to leave me alone," he said. I remembered that day, how he'd screamed at me in front of everyone after his parents' funeral. "I was so mad at you for having parents who picked you up every day," he continued. His voice was flat like he was reading from a script. "Mine were dead, and yours complained about traffic, and I hated you for it." He kicked at the wood chips under the swing. "I'm sorry I pushed you away." I wanted to say something, but he was already walking back to the car, and I knew from experience that pushing Adrian to talk when he wasn't ready only made him shut down more. What's making Adrian suddenly need a fake girlfriend after 6 years of silence? There's something deeper than just his grandmother's wish here. The way his voice shook on that 2 a.m. call tells me he's dealing with more than grief. We edited the photos in his living room, adjusting filters to make them look older, adding timestamps from different years. That night, my phone rang at 11 p.m., Adrian's panicked voice telling me his grandmother was getting worse. I threw on shoes and drove to the hospital, finding him pacing in the waiting room. The doctor came out with that careful expression they use for bad news. "Her organs are starting to shut down," she explained. "We're looking at days, maybe a week if we're lucky." Adrian collapsed into a chair and I sat next to him, pulling his head against my shoulder while he sobbed. His whole body shook and he kept saying he couldn't do this, couldn't lose her too, couldn't be alone. "You won't be alone," I heard myself promise. "I'm here, I'll stay. You won't be alone." The words felt bigger than our fake engagement, heavier than the ring on my finger, and I realized I meant them. Adrian cried harder, his tears soaking through my shirt, and I just held him while other people in the waiting room pretended not to notice. The next morning, his grandmother was alert again, asking for us the moment she woke up. She wanted to talk about the wedding, asking about venues and flowers and guest lists. Adrian and I made things up on the spot, saying we wanted something small, maybe in her church, nothing fancy. She suggested spring for the date and we agreed, both of us knowing she wouldn't make it that long but playing along anyway. "I wish I could be there," she said softly. Adrian squeezed her hand and told her she would be, that we'd carry her with us, and I had to look away because the lie felt too big for the small hospital room. My phone started buzzing with unknown numbers, and Adrian checked his to find dozens of missed calls from his agent. Someone had taken photos of us at the hospital and posted them online with headlines about the model's secret engagement. His agent was furious when Adrian finally answered, complaining about contracts and brand image and publicity schedules. Adrian listened for about 30 seconds before telling them to either deal with it or find a new model to represent. The agent sputtered about obligations and opportunities, but Adrian hung up and turned his phone off completely. "Some things matter more than money," he said, looking at his grandmother who had fallen asleep again. The next few days fell into a pattern where I'd show up at the hospital every night around 7 with takeout bags from whatever place was still open. Adrian hadn't left his grandmother's side except to use the bathroom, and I could see the exhaustion in how he moved. We'd eat in the empty cafeteria under those harsh fluorescent lights while I pulled out my laptop for thesis interviews. He'd answer my questions between bites of food, and I typed as fast as I could to keep up. One night, he was talking about his modeling career and how it started after his grandmother saw a talent scout at the mall. He said something about how the camera lets him be whoever people need him to be without actually being anyone at all. Then he looked right at me and said he was tired of pretending all the time. The way he said it made my stomach flip, and I forgot what my next question was supposed to be. The cafeteria suddenly felt too small and too quiet. I closed my laptop and we just sat there looking at each other until a nurse came in for her break. The next morning, I got an email from Ailsa saying I needed to come to her office immediately about my thesis. She had a stack of new consent forms on her desk that basically asked me to explain my exact relationship with Adrian and how it might affect my research. The forms wanted details about our engagement and whether it was real or not. I stared at the questions not knowing how to answer because I honestly didn't know anymore myself. Ailsa watched me struggle with the paperwork and finally said to just be as honest as I could. I wrote that our relationship status was complicated and evolving, which felt like the biggest understatement ever. 2 days later, Adrian's phone wouldn't stop buzzing during lunch, and he finally answered it with clear annoyance. His agency had scheduled a major campaign shoot for some luxury brand, and they needed him there tomorrow. He couldn't miss it without breaking his contract and facing huge penalties. He asked if I'd come with him as his fiancée for support, and I agreed, even though the idea of seeing his professional world made me nervous. The shoot was at this massive warehouse converted into a studio, and watching Adrian work was like watching someone flip a switch. The second he stepped in front of the cameras, he became someone completely different. His whole body changed, and his face turned into this mask of confidence that looked nothing like the tired guy I'd been eating cafeteria food with. Between takes, though, he kept looking over at me like he was checking I hadn't left. The photographer kept calling for him to hold certain poses, and Adrian did it perfectly every time, but I could see how much effort it took. During a break, the photographer came over and introduced himself as Reese Delgado. He mentioned how Adrian seemed different today, and more grounded than usual. Reese started taking candid shots of us just sitting together during the break, and when he showed them on his camera screen, my chest got tight. We looked like an actual couple in those photos, and not like we were pretending at all. That evening, Adrian's grandmother was having one of her good days where she was alert and talkative. She pulled out this old photo album from her bedside table and started showing us pictures of Adrian's parents. There were photos from their wedding and their first apartment, and Adrian as a baby. She told stories about how his dad used to sing in the shower every morning, and how his mom collected snow globes from every place they visited. Adrian learned his parents had planned to open a bakery together before the accident. His grandmother looked at me and said they would have loved me me because I made their son smile the way they used to. Adrian had to leave the room after that, and I found him on the hospital roof later just sitting on a bench looking at the stars. He asked if I ever thought about what would have happened if he hadn't pushed me away 6 years ago. I told him I used to think about it all the time and wonder if we'd still be friends or maybe something more. We both went quiet after that and just sat there watching planes blink across the sky. The next day, I went to bring Adrian lunch and couldn't find him anywhere in the hospital. I finally spotted his car in the parking lot and found him asleep in the back seat with a blanket that looked like it came from the gift shop. He'd been sleeping there instead of going home because he didn't want to be far from his grandmother. I convinced him to come to my apartment to shower and get some real sleep with the promise we'd go right back. He was so tired he didn't even argue and fell asleep in my car on the 5-minute drive. While he was in my shower, my phone rang and it was his grandmother's nurse saying she was asking for both of us urgently. Adrian came out with wet hair and I just pointed at my phone and we ran back to the car without him even drying off properly. We rushed into her room expecting the worst, but she was sitting up in bed with her jewelry box on her lap. She insisted we take it right now while she could watch us do it because she wanted to see our faces when we looked through everything. Inside the box were these old pearl earrings and a bracelet that looked like it had been worn every day for decades, and some rings that probably belonged to Adrian's mom. Adrian picked up each piece carefully like they might break if he breathed too hard, and his grandmother told us stories about where each one came from. She was just explaining how Adrian's grandfather proposed with absolutely no ring at all when this loud voice came from the doorway. Adrian's old agent stood there in a suit that probably cost more than my car, looking annoyed. He started going off about how Adrian wasn't answering his calls and how the engagement photos online were already getting tons of attention and they needed to strike while the iron was hot. Adrian stood up so fast his chair scraped against the floor and told him to get out. The agent kept pushing, saying this was the perfect opportunity to rebrand Adrian as the devoted grandson and fiancé, and the contracts he could get would be huge. Adrian's face went completely cold and he said he was done, and to consider their contract terminated effective immediately. The agent started threatening legal action and career suicide, but Adrian just walked over and physically guided him out of the room. His grandmother had gone really quiet during all this, and when Adrian came back, she grabbed his hand and started apologizing. She said she never meant to put us in this position, and maybe she was being selfish with her dying wish. Adrian and I both told her at the same time that bringing us back together was the best thing she could have done. I meant it too, which surprised me. The next morning, Ailsa showed up at the hospital to check on my thesis progress since I'd missed our last 2 meetings. I introduced her to Adrian, who was half asleep in the chair, and she watched us for a while as we went through our normal routine of me bringing him coffee and him automatically reaching for my hand when his grandmother's monitors beat. After we talked in the hallway, she told me my research had completely shifted from objective study to something she called participatory observation. She said it could actually make my thesis stronger if I leaned into it instead of fighting it. Over the next few days, we fell into this weird pattern where Adrian would come to my apartment around noon to sleep for 4 or 5 hours while I stayed at the hospital. He'd show up looking dead on his feet and I'd already have the bed made with fresh sheets and blackout curtains drawn. Hospital cafeteria interviews where your fake fiancé admits he's tired of pretending while looking straight at you. That's research gold and also possibly the worst timing for feelings to get real when grandma's monitors keep beeping down the hall. We never really talked about it but developed this whole system where I'd leave him notes about his grandmother's condition and he'd leave me food in the fridge for when I got back. It felt weirdly intimate even though we barely saw each other awake. One night his grandmother was having trouble sleeping and asked the nurse to give us some privacy. She looked right at me and asked if I really loved her grandson or if I was just being nice because she was dying. The question hit me like a punch, and I found myself telling her the truth that I'd loved him since we were 8 years old, and he shared his sandwich with me when I forgot my lunch. Saying it out loud made my chest feel tight and my hands shake because it was real and I couldn't take it back. She smiled and patted my hand and said she knew but wanted to hear me say it. The next afternoon, Adrian was going through his grandmother's closet looking for a specific sweater she wanted and found this old cardboard box with his name written on it in kid handwriting. Inside were all these photos of us as kids that his parents must have taken and this little diary from when he was 10. He turned bright red when he saw it and tried to hide it, but I grabbed it first. Page after page talked about how he was going to marry me someday and how I was the prettiest girl in the school even though I punched him that one time. I told him 10-year-old Adrian had excellent taste and he threw a pillow at me, but he was smiling. 3 days later, we had to meet with a hospital social worker about end-of-life care decisions. The woman was nice enough, but when she started talking about funeral homes and burial versus cremation, Adrian completely froze. His whole body went rigid and he just stared at the paperwork. I took over the conversation and filled out all the forms while holding his hand under the table, so tight I thought I might break his fingers. He didn't say a single word the entire meeting. That night we were walking to his car in the hospital parking lot and he suddenly stopped and kissed me. Not a fake kiss for show, but a real one that made my knees weak. Then he immediately pulled back and started apologizing, saying he was taking advantage of my kindness and he was sorry. I grabbed his shirt and pulled him back down and kissed him properly and told him to stop deciding what I wanted for me. We stood there in the parking lot for a while just holding each other and agreed to be honest about whatever was happening between us. We both knew the situation was complicated with his grandmother and the fake engagement, but we decided to just take things day by day without putting labels on anything. A week later, Adrian told me he'd signed with a new agency that Adelia Cohen was running. She apparently respected his boundaries about privacy and didn't push him to do jobs he wasn't comfortable with. The pay was way less than his old agency, but he seemed lighter somehow, like a weight had been lifted off his shoulders. 2 days later, his grandmother asked for Adrian's phone and started recording herself talking to the camera while we sat beside her bed helping her prop up the pillows. She recorded birthday messages for the next 10 years telling him she loved him and was proud of him no matter what happened. She made one for his wedding day saying she knew I'd look beautiful in white and Adrian would probably cry when he saw me walking down the aisle. She recorded advice about changing diapers and dealing with teething babies and how to make her special soup when kids got sick. Adrian held the phone steady while she talked, but his hands shook so bad I had to take over halfway through. She made us promise to save them all and not watch until the right times, and we both nodded even though I knew Adrian would probably watch them all the second he got home. That same afternoon, I went back to campus and turned in my thesis draft to Ailsa with a whole new section about how grief shapes who we become based on all my interviews with Adrian. She read through it right there in her office while I sat fidgeting with a ring on my finger that I'd gotten used to wearing. She looked up when she finished and told me it was the most honest and powerful work I'd ever done, and asked if I was sure I wanted to include such personal material. I said yes, because Adrian's story deserved to be told, even if it meant exposing parts of myself too. 3 days later, I was in the middle of grocery shopping when Adrian called, and his voice was completely flat, saying the doctor needed to talk to us right away. I left my cart in the middle of the cereal aisle and drove straight to the hospital, where the doctor was waiting outside his grandmother's room with that look medical people get when they have to deliver bad news. He said her organs were shutting down, and it was time to call any family who wanted to say goodbye. Adrian stood there staring at the doctor like he was speaking a foreign language until the words sank in that there was no other family to call, because he was literally the only one left. His legs gave out, and he slid down the wall right there in the hallway, and I had to help him back up while the nurses pretended not to notice. We spent the next 36 hours in her room taking turns reading her favorite romance novels out loud, even though she was mostly unconscious by then. Adrian played her old jazz records on his phone, and I told her stories about our fake dates that had started feeling real. Sometimes she'd squeeze our hands when we talked, and we'd both lean forward hoping she'd wake up, but she'd slip back under within seconds. The second night, I was half asleep in the chair when she suddenly opened her eyes completely clear and looked right at Adrian, who jerked awake immediately. She told him she wasn't scared because she was going to see his parents again, and they'd all be waiting for him someday, but not for a very long time. She made him promise to live fully and stop pushing people away, and then she looked straight at me when she said he needed to let people love him. Adrian was crying so hard he could barely speak, but he promised and kissed her forehead while she smiled. Later that night, Adrian finally fell asleep, slumped in the chair still holding her hand, and I was about to doze off too when she opened her eyes again and looked right at me. Her voice was barely a whisper, but she asked me to take care of him, and I promised I would no matter what happened with our fake engagement or anything else. She said she knew I would from the moment she saw us together again, because some things don't change even after 6 years apart. The next morning, the sun was just coming through the blinds when her breathing changed and became shallow and rattled. Adrian woke up instantly and grabbed her hand tighter while I held her other one, and we both told her we loved her and it was okay to let go. She took one more breath and then just stopped, and the room went completely quiet except for the heart monitor flatline sound that seemed way too loud. Adrian didn't cry or move or anything, just sat there still holding her hand, staring at her face like maybe if he waited long enough she'd start breathing again. The nurses came in and turned off the machines and asked if we needed a minute, and Adrian couldn't even answer, so I said yes, and they left us alone. I worried about what was happening inside him, sitting there so still and quiet when he should be falling apart. We stayed there for almost an hour before Adrian finally let go of her hand and stood up and walked out without saying anything. The next few days blurred together as we handled all the funeral arrangements, and I was amazed at how naturally we worked as a team without even discussing it. When Adrian couldn't pick between caskets, I made the choice, and when I started crying while picking flowers, he took over and was selected her favorites. He trusted me completely with decisions about the service and burial plot and everything else his grandmother would have wanted. The funeral was small, with just some neighbors and her book club friends and the staff from the hospital who'd grown fond of her. Adrian stood at the podium in his black suit, looking like he might shatter into pieces, but his voice stayed steady as he talked about how his grandmother saved him twice in his life. First when his parents died and she became everything to him, and second when she brought me back into his life, and he looked right at me when he said it. After everyone left the cemetery, we drove to his grandmother's house and walked through the front door that still smelled like her perfume and the cookies she'd baked the week before she went to the hospital for the last time. Adrian made it 3 steps inside before he completely broke down and collapsed on the living room floor, sobbing so hard his whole body shook. I sat down and pulled him against me and just held him while years of grief poured out and soaked through my shirt, and I didn't let go even when my arms went numb, because sometimes holding someone is all you can do. Hours passed before Adrian finally stopped shaking and pulled away from me with swollen eyes and his grandmother's throw pillow clutched against his chest. We started going through her things slowly, and I found a thick leather album tucked behind old photo boxes in the closet that made Adrian freeze when he saw it. The wedding album showed his grandparents young and smiling, and Adrian looked exactly like his grandfather, down to the way his eyes crinkled when he smiled. Tucked inside the front cover was a handwritten note dated just 2 weeks ago that said the ring should go to someone who loved Adrian for exactly who he was, not what he looked like or what he could give them. Adrian traced his finger over the words and then looked at me still wearing the ring and asked if I wanted to slow things down now that his grandmother was gone and we didn't have a reason to pretend anymore. I'm really curious how they managed to switch between being fake engaged and having real feelings without getting confused about which was which. The way Adrian's grandmother saw through everything and got them to admit the truth is so interesting. Did she plan this whole thing to bring them back together before she died? Commentary ends here. I told him the only reason I needed was that I wanted to be with him, and he started crying again, but softer this time, like relief instead of grief. We spent the next week sorting through the house and boxing things up, and Adrian suggested we take a real vacation together, just a weekend, to figure out who we were without hospitals and grief and pretending. 3 days later, we drove 5 hours to the coast and rented this tiny cabin that smelled like salt water and old wood and had a view of the ocean from the bedroom window. Walking on the beach that first morning, Adrian started talking about everything he'd wanted to say during our 6 years apart, and the words poured out like water through a broken dam. He apologized for pushing me away and told me about his first modeling job and how scared he was, and asked if I'd dated anyone serious, and admitted he'd looked me up online dozens of times, but never had the courage to reach out. I told him we had time now for all of it, and we spent hours walking and talking until our feet were numb from the cold water. My phone buzzed with an email from Reese, who'd sent the candid photos from that shoot, and we sat on the cabin porch scrolling through them, shocked at how we looked in every single one. The way Adrian was looking at me in those photos made my chest tight because it was the same way he looked at me now, and we thought we were pretending, but the camera caught what we couldn't admit. Adrian made his phone background right there, and I pretended not to notice how his hands shook a little when he did it. 2 weeks after we got back, we started therapy together because neither of us knew how to process everything that had happened, and the therapist helped us sort through what was real from what we thought was performance. Most of it was real and always had been, which made us us both laugh and cry in the same session more than once. Adrian came to every therapy appointment, even when work conflicted, and I watched him slowly learn to talk about his parents and his grandmother without shutting down completely. Spring came, and I defended my thesis with Adrian sitting in the front row of the small lecture hall wearing the suit he'd worn to his grandmother's funeral, but with a proud smile this time. My committee asked hard questions about objectivity and bias, but they were impressed by the depth and honesty of the work and how I documented the intersection of grief and identity through Adrian's story. When I thanked Adrian in my acknowledgments for trusting me with his story, he wiped his eyes quickly, but I saw it, and so did everyone else. That same week, Adrian signed with Adelia's agency full-time after firing his old agency completely, and he started being selective about jobs instead of taking everything offered. He chose campaigns that meant something to him, and turned down twice the money for things that didn't align with his values, and I'd never seen him look so centered and sure of himself. We started looking for apartments together in May, and found one with big windows and hardwood floors, nothing like his grandmother's house, but we brought some of her furniture anyway. Her ring box sat on our dresser next to a photo of all three of us from that last good day at the hospital, and every morning I saw Adrian touch it gently before getting dressed. The apartment felt like ours immediately, and we fell into rhythms of cooking dinner together, and Adrian teaching me about photography while I helped him practice for interviews. 6 months after that first phone call, Adrian asked me to meet him at the hospital, and I found him on the roof where we'd sat that night looking at stars. The sun was setting, and the city spread out below us, and Adrian got down on one knee properly this time with words about choosing each other and building a life, and how his grandmother was right about us finding our way back. He talked about love and future, and how I made him brave enough to feel things again, and asked if I would marry him for real this time, not for anyone else, but for us. The word yes came out of my mouth so fast that Adrian actually laughed while sliding the ring back on my finger. He told me he'd been scared I'd want time to think about it, but I grabbed his face and told him I'd had 6 years to think, and I was done wasting time. We kissed right there on that hospital roof with the city lights below us, and for once everything felt completely right and real. 3 weeks later, we stood in the hospital chapel where his grandmother had been treated with just Ailsa and Reese, and a few other close friends watching us exchange vows. The chaplain who'd comforted Adrian during those awful nights officiated, and we both cried when he mentioned how his grandmother would have loved seeing this moment. Adrian wore the suit from his first big modeling campaign, and I wore a simple dress we found at a thrift store that his grandmother would have called perfect. Reese took photos that captured us laughing through tears, and Ailsa signed as our witness with the biggest smile I'd ever seen on her face. After the ceremony, Adrian surprised me by announcing he was starting a foundation in his grandmother's name, using money from his modeling work to help kids who'd lost their parents. He'd already filed the paperwork and set up the first donation to the Children's Grief Center at the hospital where we'd spent so many nights. The social worker who'd helped us cried when Adrian handed her the check and told her his grandmother would have loved knowing she was still taking care of people. 2 months later, I opened an acceptance letter to the graduate program for grief and identity research while Adrian made breakfast in our kitchen. He read it over my shoulder and immediately lifted me up, spinning me around, saying he knew I'd get in, and joking that he was definitely my best case study, which honestly wasn't wrong at all. That summer, we finally went through his grandmother's house properly, instead of just grabbing things we needed. We found boxes of photos and letters and Adrian's baby clothes that his mother had saved, and we decided to keep the house instead of selling it. We spent weekends stripping old wallpaper and painting walls, and Adrian learned to use power tools from YouTube videos while I planted new rose bushes in the garden where his grandmother's old ones had died. The neighbor who'd known his family for 40 years brought us casseroles and told us stories about Adrian's parents we'd never heard before. On the first anniversary of his grandmother's death, we drove to the cemetery with flowers and sat by her headstone for hours. Adrian told her about the foundation and how 12 kids had already gotten help, and I told her about my research and how understanding grief was helping me understand love better. Adrian traced her name on the stone and said he finally understood what she meant about pictures lasting longer than people, because it wasn't really about pictures at all, but about love being the thing that actually lasts forever. 3 months after that, I was throwing up every morning, and Adrian drove me to the drugstore at midnight to buy 5 different pregnancy tests that all came back positive. We sat on our bathroom floor staring at those little plus signs, and Adrian started crying harder than I'd ever seen him cry, even during the worst hospital nights. He kept saying his grandmother was right about our kids being beautiful, and how much he wished she could meet them, and I held him while we both cried and laughed at the same time. The ultrasound tech printed extra pictures when she saw Adrian's face during our first appointment, and he immediately framed one for his desk at the modeling agency, where he'd started mentoring younger models about maintaining boundaries and mental health. Now we sit in our renovated living room with Adrian's hand on my growing belly while we look at all the photos covering our walls. There's his parents on their wedding day, and his grandmother as a young woman, and us as kids with gap-toothed grins, and our wedding in the hospital chapel, and the ultrasound photo and selfies from painting the house. Adrian kisses my forehead and says something about how we built the family he thought he'd lost forever, and I realized that's exactly what we did without even meaning to. We took all those broken pieces and somehow made something whole and new and ours. Makes you wonder what those 3 board members were really thinking when they said their hands were tied. Feels like there's definitely some behind the scenes we're not seeing. Like the video, it helps more than you think.